Welcome to Tales of Britain and Ireland. This is a podcast telling the stories, legends and folktales of Britain and Ireland in no particular order. Presented by Graham and coming direct from South Yorkshire, each episode tells a story or selection of stories from all across these islands and throughout their history, followed by a short and decidedly inexpert discussion of the origin and themes of each tale. Let's jump straight into it with a quick prologue. It was not a dark and stormy night. It had been but a few hours before, but now it was a pleasantly warm summer's morning. The only clouds in the sky were delightful, fluffy cotton wool white, as though to emphasise the perfect blue in which they drifted. This was an ideal morning for a wedding, and fortuitously enough, one had been arranged. The guests gathered in groups on their way to the churchyard, clad in what passed for their finery. This was not a wedding of the most wealthy, but of a farmer's daughter and a farmer's son. Yet great numbers flocked to the wedding of fair Rebecca, the most beautiful girl in the village, well loved by all. The previous night some had feared the nuptials might be ruined by the ferocity of the storm, but just for once the gruff Yorkshire weather had been kind. This was a community event. Friends and family of the immediately betrothed, and friends and family of them, and friends and family of them, and so on and so forth. A wedding then was really just a bit of a party to which absolutely everyone was invited. The groom was there, looking suitably nervous, pacing back and forth, as all waited on the bride. Fair Becca. The light, joyous conversation amongst most was increasingly punctuated by bouts of much confused questioning between various parties. Between the vicar and the mother and father of the bride at first, the bridesmaid and the church wardens, and eventually the groom's party too, and the ever-increasing ripple of consternation began to darken the day in a way even the worst weather never could. "Is she not with you? We thought she was with you. No, when did you last see her?" Though they tried, they couldn't keep it from her husband-to-be. He looked up, eyes filled with worry. "She's coming, yes?" "Of course she's coming," said the bride's father. "We'll find her." But they didn't find her. Didn't find her that whole day, nor the next, and still the one after that. Even though by then the search had grown furious, with every able-bodied man of the community involved. No one believed that Becca had done some midnight flit. She was simply not that sort of woman. And so theories of what had happened to her took a darker turn, and soon enough, a man was found who had been travelling the lonely roads the night before the wedding, and he swore that in the midst of the storm he had heard a terrible blood-curdling cry, as though of a woman's voice, carried by the wind, and the villagers of Horton began to fear the worst. Hello everybody and welcome back to the 50th episode of Tales of Britain and Ireland, which given my release schedule has been a very long time coming. First of all, a massive thank you to all of you who have listened over the years and are still listening now. I didn't really think I'd ever get this far, and it's your support that's meant I have done. If this is your first episode, well, it's probably not an altogether too terrible one to start with, though this will be a bit less story than some of them. For here there are many disparate accounts of one of my absolute favourite pieces of folklore that I've mostly held off from including in the podcast until this moment. And that piece of folklore is, to nobody's surprise, you can see the episode title, it is Boggarts. In this episode I'll be telling stories and accounts of Boggarts from across their old hunting grounds, drawn from 18th and 19th century folklore. I am going to say off the bat, though, that these Boggarts will be quite different from what many of you are no doubt expecting. However, these are absolutely traditional Boggart tales and a reasonably representative example, and you might find that surprising, or not, depending on how much you know about Boggarts already. And what most people know about Boggarts in the early 21st century is quite different from what people knew about Boggarts in the time and place that these stories are taken from. And normally I would discuss this absolutely fascinating dynamic in the inexpert discussion section of this episode. However, for this 50th episode, I'm doing something a bit different. Very different, in fact. For the first time ever, I'm going to break with the format, for I have an expert discussion section for you, with none other than the world's leading Boggart expert, Dr. Simon Young. That will be a whole other episode, which will be released a couple of weeks after this one, and which will have a story at the end of it as well. Dr. Young has collected together huge amounts of primary source material on Boggarts, and I have used these for most of the stories in this episode. On that episode, we'll be delving deep into Boggarts in all different ways, but up front and central, answering the question of, what exactly is a Boggart? Which I won't be doing quite right now, but I think the answer is a really fascinating one. Needless to say, I'm very excited to bring that to you, and I hope you actually enjoy getting some real expert information for a change. One other thing to say before we get into this episode is that as a present to both myself and the wider world, for this 50th I commissioned several artists to draw pictures of Boggarts as they were imagined in 19th century folklore. These pictures are obviously on my website, but they're now also illustrating the Boggart article on Wikipedia, and people can also use them by a share-alike license. So basically anyone can use these images as long as they give credit to the artists. This means that people all across the world will now have access to Boggart pictures that are closer to how they were actually seen in 19th century folklore, rather than most of the pictures of Boggarts online now, which are much more like Boggarts in later children's and fantasy literature. I'm incredibly pleased by the results, and a massive thanks to all the artists who helped out. They really are an incredible bunch of pictures. Those artists are Lino Folk by Fiona, Sean Ellis, Jantif Illustrations, and Ree Winter, and you can see the results on my website page, or of course, on Wikipedia. So to recap, no inexpert discussion today, but for your expert discussion section, tune in to the next episode. There are pictures of Boggarts by supremely talented artists available to you now, and go and gaze upon them, though they're slightly spoilerific. And that's about all there is to say. I should probably get around to telling you some stories about Boggarts, except before I do so, one last little thing. This episode does feature some male on female violence. I've not made anything graphic, and it's not sexual in nature, but if that's a particular issue for you, you might want to give this one a miss, or at least the last story. So let's launch into this episode by perhaps picturing dim and distant days when, to quote from an old book from Lancashire, quote, "On a very cold, wild winter's night, you might have seen a very old person sat in a very old chair by a very large fire, in a large old chimney corner, in a very old-fashioned room, in a very old house. Opposite was a very old long settee with a black oaken back and a very soft old-fashioned cushion, which made it very comfortable to sit upon on such a very cold, wild night. And all the children of the house might gather around, and on that long settee, the window blinds down, the shutters closed, they could hear the wind roar like thunder in that old chimney, and drive the rain tremendously against the shutters. And the children would gaze on the aged storyteller and ask him or her, 'Will you tell us the stories like you promised?' Do you want a heroic tale? Or perhaps a romance? Or maybe, on a night like tonight, some scary stories would be best." "Scary stories!" they chorus in agreement. "All right then." And the master storyteller would take off their glasses, rub their eyes, then place them back on the tip of their nose, lean forward and say, "Let me tell you about Boggarts." The house stood alone and lonely, off to the side of the long winding track. The road between Carnforth and Bolton-le-Sands was well travelled, walkers, riders and carters going back and forth day after day. Few ever passed by that long abandoned house without in some way taking note of it. Those in groups might simply laugh it off, boldly point it out, make woo noises, or start telling the story of why it lay abandoned. Tell of a murder most foul that had been committed many years previous, replete with grisly ad-lib details, which probably deviated quite far from the facts of the matter, for no one now living remembered the real circumstances of the terrible crime. Other passers-by would fall into a heavy, grey silence until the house was well past and the sky seemed brighter again. Yet others would feel the need to prevent there being such a silence, strike up a cheerful whistle, speak too fast and with a forced lightness about trivial topics. A lone rider might find himself having a conversation with his horse. As evening approached, the brave, boisterous travellers would be all the fewer, and those passing would hurry on, fancying they heard the faint rustle of leaves from nearby trees, and there was a cold, hair-raising sensation that trickled down their neck all the way to their feet. Those who had the misfortune to travel by night, they passed the Boggart house even more quickly and quietly, ignored as best they could any sounds, low moanings. Those must be the wind in the trees. Footsteps on the road, surely imagined, and even the sound of breaking glass from the inhabitantless house. A fox must have gotten in. They ignored, too, any flickering lights, surely an odd effect of the moon or stars, and even the sight of a flame from that house would be excused. Probably swamp gas. Though by the time the flames were rising, many of them found that their horses had taken matters into their own hands and carried them far, far away. But there were an unfortunate few who found themselves in a position where the house and its boggart could not be ignored. It was a cold January night, and the farmer was wrapped up warm on his cart. The road was at least well lit, a gibbous moon in a sky with few clouds. He was off to market at Kendal, to sell the wheat that piled high upon the cart, and at this time of year he'd always be travelling in darkness at some point, whenever he set off. So he had no choice but to travel at night, and his destination was still a few hours distant yet. It was to his misfortune that he had failed to plan his timings exactly to take proper account of the Boggart house, and he therefore happened to be approaching the section of track along which it sat just as the witching hour fell. That time when poets say that churchyards yawn and hell breathes itself out of the grave. Which was not the ideal time to be near the Boggart house. His horse noticed it first. Its ears pricked straight up, and it came to a sudden stop, making frightened growling and whinnyings. The farmer, half asleep, was jolted into consciousness. Looking ahead in the darkness, he could see a shape. It was a sheep, asleep across the road. He, really, annoyed rather than anything else, having not yet registered his proximity to the Boggart-haunted house. He swung himself down from his wagon, taking with him his horsewhip. He'd get that sheep gone. He trudged towards the beast, weapon in hand. Even as he got closer, it didn't rouse itself. Stupid sheep, must have been sleeping deeply. He shooted it a few times, but when that did nothing, he brought down his whip on it with one fierce blow. A blow which did not make contact with anything until it hit the ground. The farmer almost toppled and fell as the whip passed straight through the body of the sheep. The sheep which nevertheless rolled away and turned to face him. He staggered backwards as its eyes fixed on him. The familiar shape of a sheep's face, yes, but those eyes, far more intelligent and loathsome. It roused its incorporeal body onto its legs in one swift motion, and just as he prepared for it to charge him, the creature, it grew bigger and bigger, expanding like some sort of sheep balloon or cloud, and the astonished, terrified man walked backwards at pace, until he found himself gazing up at the ginormous creature that now looked down upon him, as big as a house, the moonbeams refracting off it, lighting up the night. It lowered its impossibly large head, gave the man a look of absolute contempt, and then, in a great burst of flame, it dissipated into the night. He never made it to market that next day. He was discovered a while later by fellow travellers, still in a state of shock, and was taken to bed, and a week later he had yet to recover. Though I'm sure he might have had difficulty describing such a bizarre sight, embarrassment maybe, well, most were not surprised at all, took it very seriously. He was not the first nor the last to see the boggart of the house, though it came in diverse forms. Not just a sheep, but a gigantic goose with a terrifying honk that deafened, and a man clad in the uniform of a soldier, quite without his head. And in the weeks following the farmer's encounter, as word of it spread, those who passed the boggart house did so with even more trepidation than usual. You could even say they passed it particularly sheepishly. Yep, that's right, the terrible puns are the scariest thing of all. Ooh. Let's now move an indeterminate number of years backwards or forwards in time and go south until we arrive at another dark, winding country lane, well before electric lighting and the horseless carriage had brightened and widened them respectively. This lane is Cop Lane. No lonely boggart house here, just a muddy track and a couple of hedges, and a fellow of more dissolute reputation than the hard-toiling farmer of the previous story. He is staggering home after a successful night's winnings at the card table in a disreputable house in the district of Long Eccleston. He was very much the worse or better for wear, depending on your perspective, and the journey had been dragging on a while now. But he didn't mind. He was wandering this way and that, occasionally breaking into song, and he was now but 10 minutes from his own front door and his bed, feeling rather pleased with himself when he saw the light in the middle of the road up ahead. A candle light. Someone coming the other way? He squinted through the haze of alcohol and exuberance. No, not a traveller. It was the wrong height for a carried lantern, and more to the point, it wasn't moving. He shook his head, rubbed his eyes, but there it remained, in the very middle of the path that he had walked down countless times in his life. Well, onwards he continued, and as he got closer he could make out a bit more. The candle was on a table. A table? A table in the middle of this muddy rural road in the middle of the night? He was trying to sober up fast now to make sense of it. Not just any table either this, but a table that looked very similar to that in the house he'd just come from. A card table. An empty chair was on one side, and on the other, shrouded in darkness, was a figure. Indistinct. In the flickering orange light, only hands could be seen, in white gloves, shuffling a deck of cards with expert ease. This was very, very wrong. But in his inebriated state, our unnamed card shark didn't care. He took a few more steps forward and then said words to the effect of, "You want to play a hand then, fella?" A velvet voice issued forth from the darkness. "I do." "Well, I'll play anyone, and I'll beat them too," said the drunk, fired up with Dutch courage. "So I understand," came the voice from the darkness, and the figure leaned forward into the glow. A pointed, angular face with a sharply cut, forked beard, red, glowing eyes, and a pair of horns atop his head. And had our card player been a braver man, then this tale might have had a different ending. But at this supernatural sight, he had no problem swiftly swallowing down the words he'd only just uttered. And rather than sitting down with this boggart who may well be Lucifer himself, he turned tail and he fled, sobering up incredibly fast as he ran down the lane, through the night, away from his own house back to Long Eccleston, never taking a look back until he was at the door to that carding house from which he had come, pounding on it. "Let me in! Let me in!" And when the door was opened, he collapsed, a bloodless image of despair, with chattering teeth and stiffened greying hair. It is unclear if he ever played cards again. Now, like unto the Carnford boggart, others on Cop Lane saw this boggart in a huge variety of other forms. A drifting silk dress, a giant donkey, a dog with a white neck and a tail that put one in mind of a sheaf of corn, all curled up over its shoulder, until it vanished in flames. A very specific description, that one. I might have fled from the dog before I'd noticed the peculiarities of its tail, but there were hardy folk back then. Such intensely different descriptions were par for the course of boggart hauntings, for it was well documented that boggarts could change their forms, attested to by the undeniable evidence of countless similar tales of very different-looking creatures. Or, as one 19th century folklorist put it, quote, "They appeared as bears, dogs, rabbits, or other invincible animals, which would have fairly puzzled the most skillful zoologist either to name or classify," unquote. Or sometimes they appeared not at all, but made themselves well known by their actions, in houses where sheets were pulled from beds at night by unseen hands, crockeries smashed, doors slammed shut. Or shouting out from the churchyard when all right-thinking people were in bed, jumping onto the horses of foolish midnight travellers and holding tight on behind. They were waiting on bridges, watching at crossroads, perched on the lich gate of the local church, could be found in canal tunnels at the edge of villages, or perhaps sweeping through the great old halls that dotted the land, leaving naught but bloodstains and terror in their wake. It was invariably in the darkness that they made their presence known, and they held the people of the land in a grip of icy terror. Not always present, perhaps, but always a possibility in the gloomy nights where they dwelt, clustered at the in-between places, what some scholars with highfalutin ideas have termed the edge lands, where the civilised and the natural abut and intermingle, those places where village and town met field and moor, those places too which were once the abodes of humanity, but which had been left to lonely wrack and ruin, and also the places that were the mirror image of that, where recent memory were all woodland and stream and meadow, and which were now thrust unwilling into the very vanguard of industrialisation's rapacious spread. Here could the boggarts be found, in all their incomprehensible frightfulness and grotesque variety. And aside from calling them boggarts, the people also referred to them as the feeorin, those who inspired fear. Solitary dwellers in the darkness. And who were the they who called them boggarts? Well, they were the inhabitants of a number of English counties, but very much centred on Lancashire and the areas immediately around it, and not the much reduced county of Lancashire today, butchered as to be almost nothing. No, for these stories we are in a much greater Lancashire, a Lancashire that might be able to truly rival Yorkshire in a way the current county cannot. A Lancashire that takes in all of Greater Manchester and Liverpool, and the bounds of the lands where boggarts dwelt extended even beyond this great Lancashire, into parts of Yorkshire in the east, snaking down into Cheshire and reaching almost as far down to the south as Stoke-on-Trent. These are lands that Dr. Simon Young refers to with the collective title of Boggartdom. And it's from Boggartdom that these stories are drawn, a greater area than simply Lancashire, but undeniably centred upon it. And I do know that many of you listen from Ireland and America and the south of England and places even more exotic than that, and so all of this may mean nothing to you, so as much as it pains me to say it, all you really need to know is that this is the northwest side of England going into the centre, and that is probably close enough for you. But while I will expand on this in the discussion section, I do not want you to think that the rest of the country was free from these nighttime terrors. To some extent, a boggart might be considered that whole arose by any other name thing here, for a barguest or a spectre or a boggle or a dobby might all be very similar to a boggart, indistinguishable in their innate character perhaps. But their character wasn't all that makes a boggart, because, as the incredibly badly butchered meme might have it, it's only a boggart if it comes from the roughly Lancashire region of England. Otherwise, it's just something startling in the night time. Obviously, in the hundreds of years over which tales of boggarts were told, this area changed a lot, and indeed the accounts almost always emphasise the change in the county and the impact of that on boggarts. Nevertheless, I will attempt to give a general description of the landscape by turning to podcast favourite character archetype 19th century folklorists, by turning to the writings of one James Bowker. I feel his words do it justice in a way your humble narrator simply cannot compete with, so I'm going to do something I don't often do and give an extended quote. I hope the beauty of his words make up for my lack of originality. Bowker paints a picture of a pre-modern Lancashire as a world consisting of, quote, bleak fells, deep and gloomy gorges, wild cloughs, desolate moorlands, salt marshes where breeze bent and mysterious-looking trees wave their spectral boughs in the wind, the dark pools fringed with reeds, dreary glens, dark lakes and long stretches of sand in the north and west. Much of the land was not only uncultivated, but was, for at least a portion of the year, covered by sheets of water, the highways being little more than bridle roads, the carts in several of the rural districts being laid aside in winter as utterly useless, and grain and other commodities, even in summertime, were conveyed from place to place on the backs of long strings of pack horses. The people lived in lonely houses and cottages, shut out from civilization and hemmed in by floating mists and by much that was awe-inspiring. With in winter additional barriers of storm, snow and flood, the yeoman, shepherd, farmer or solitary lime burner at the edge of dark found boggarts and phantoms would begin to creep about to the music of the unearthly voices heard in every sough and sigh of the wandering wind as it wailed around the isolated dwellings. Unquote. It was in this evocative pre-modern world where the boggarts were strongest, but our best documentation for them is in the time of their long, slow decline, as the forces of modernity ravaged and ordered this wild landscape. But even during those many years of decline, any individual boggart could remain just as dangerous as it ever had been. Let me tell you a few more tales of their kind. We're a couple of miles north of the most famous boggart location of all, Boggart Hole Clough, which despite its obvious appropriateness will not actually be featuring in this episode, as I covered it in an earlier episode, episode 33, Bizarre Botany and Curious Collections. It will also appear in the expert discussion section, I'm almost certain of it. I think I wandered off somewhere. The point is, we are north of there, hardly the only place in Greater Manchester to have a boggart. 3 cottages stand together somewhere in the vicinity of what is now Alcrington Woods, or thereabouts. Their exact location has long since been lost to history. Spore Valley the place was called, or perhaps that should be pronounced Spar, for it was a bathing place, a river or pool, sources are shaky, that ran through the valley. Sounds positively idyllic, and in today's housing market there is no doubt that these residences would be desirable property in the extreme. But back then they were considerably less so. Their lonely position was one reason, but the other and by far the greater reason was their reputation. For these houses were notoriously haunted. If this had been the work of a Scooby-Doo villain, then by now he or she would have absolutely succeeded and could surely snap them up cheap. But it had taken some doing. For many years the inhabitants of what had just been one grand house had held out. Old John Whittaker and the 2 sisters who lived with him. A family arrangement which intrigues me and has several possible explanations, but to suggest them will be pure and scurrilous speculation on my part, so I'll keep stum for now. The Whittakers were anyway stout of heart, and for years they learned to live with the sounds of spectral footsteps on the stairs, the disturbance of furniture in the night, and even the cries of an unseen infant in the darkness. In any self-respecting horror movie, this would have sealed their fate, but this is a folktale, and they were just fine, just ignoring all these obvious signs of supernatural danger. And it was only after this intriguingly structured family's departure and the single house being split into 3 that those became uninhabitable. There were a few who stayed for a bit, workers at the local colliery, a few families and the like, but they never stayed long. The nocturnal activities of Boggart proved too much for them, understandably really, and their nerves were completely frayed, for they were far less immune to the terror of the feeorin. The very last inhabitants were an elderly couple who fled in the middle of the night, and several days elapsed before they felt able to return in the daylight, along with many, many others, to collect their furniture. After that, the 3 dwellings fell into a state of some disrepair, and whispers began to spread as to the source of the Boggart. All agreed that surely something terrible must have happened in these houses long ago, and theories were full of past atrocities. The murder of a child who had been buried under the house was the most popular. Now you might well think that the houses would be left well alone with such a sinister reputation. That stereotypical image of superstitious peasants crossing themselves as they pass close and then making as wide a berth as possible. But humans in reality are somewhat more complex than that. For while ghosts are indeed terrifying, there is a novelty about them, an attraction of sorts, perhaps even more so near a rapidly growing city in the mid-19th century. People are curious creatures by character, or at least a good enough proportion of them are, that these notorious Boggart-haunted houses soon began to attract a certain degree of interest. A slow trickle of, for want of a better term, local terror tourists who came for the thrill of it, to maybe see or hear the Boggart at work. On any light evening, a number of small groups of people might be found gathered around the houses, perhaps with enterprising sorts selling snacks or telling tales of murder and the supernatural. An impromptu ghost tour for fun and profit. Some visitors came with even loftier designs. One collier came with tools and dug up the cellars, aiming to find the bones of that poor child so it could be laid to rest. But he came away empty-handed, aside from a fire poker that had been buried for some odd reason, the uncovering of which seemed to have no detectable impact on the Boggart's presence. The visitors to the Boggart house mostly had a pretty jolly time of it all, a grand evening out. But it should be noted that when the gloaming descended, they were wont to respond, "Oh, is that the time?" and talk to one another of all the very important things they absolutely had just remembered had to be done. And then they would all swiftly depart from the houses, leaving them alone to the owls and the moonlight as darkness fell. They might like to feel the frisson of danger, but they weren't stupid. But there's always one braver than the rest. This one was a man by the name of Isaac Unsworth. He toiled long hours underground in the mines, and so his fear of darkness was rather less than that of your average man. And the bit of liquor inside him helped give him courage too. And one evening when the sun was definitely down, apropos of nothing in particular, he declared that he was off to the Boggart house to find the truth of it, once and for all. It was but a short walk from his lodgings, and he had become seized of the notion of really knowing the truth of it. Perhaps he thought fame and fortune might flow from such a discovery, or perhaps it was just that deep curiosity, that irrepressible need to know that proverbially slaughters cats. Though his companions tried to dissuade him, Isaac was having nothing of it. Off to the Spa Boggart houses the bold coal miner went, all fired up. The shortness of the walk meant he'd had no time to calm down. There was probably a spooky foreboding mise-en-scène as he approached, but he didn't pay it any attention. He wasn't angry but full of adrenaline as he reached the door of one abandoned house, and in the hand not holding a lantern, he punched the door hard. The rotting wood fair flew out of its handles, and in went Isaac shouting out, "Anyone here? Any Boggarts around?" He waited a few seconds and there was simply silence, except for the sounds of the night. So back out he went, to the door of the next house, his fist likewise colliding with that one. In he went. No boggart to be seen there either. But three's the charm. The last door he smashed in, he was about to call out. But there, on the dusty floor illuminated by lantern light, was a young girl, with a ribboned bonnet on. She turned as he entered, smiled at him, curtsied, and then she disappeared. Isaac didn't even have time to react to this, for as she did, a man entered the room as though chasing after her, a man of some considerable stature, and in his reaction to this, Isaac revealed himself not just to be very brave indeed, but incredibly stupid as well. Gentle listener, you may well have noticed that I often try to pry into the psychology of the people in these stories, to suggest motivations when none are given, not to give definitive explanations, but just to present you with some potential ones you might consider. And yet here I find it very difficult to fully rationalise this man's actions by any logic or emotion I truly understand. Though as the presenter of a storytelling podcast, I am definitely somewhat removed from the mind and heart of a 19th century drunk ghost-hunting coal miner, it should be said. So as for why he did what he did, I'm just going to go with the original account right now. That he was just so fired up on drink and so determined to confront the boggart, that seeing this supernatural tableau play out in front of his very eyes, he did none of the usual things. Scream, run, cower, stand in shock, be surprised at all. Instead, very much like St. Torog, a reference for those who have been unfortunate or blessed enough to see my live shows, very much like St. Torog, Isaac was seized by a very particular compulsion. And he shouted at this strange supernatural man, "I challenge you, sir, to a wrestling match." The phantom, not apparently one of those stone tape kind of ghosts, but a boggart fully able to interact with the world as it was, turned to Isaac. Wrestling? What are the stakes? Isaac hesitated for the first time. Maybe the adrenaline was starting to wear off slightly, but he regained his composure. "Half a gallon of ale. Yes, half a gallon of ale." "So be it," said the figure. And the two prepared themselves, adopted wrestling poses in that abandoned house, approached one another slowly. The sound of the stranger's tread was that of those footsteps that had disturbed the sleep of many a resident of these houses. There was a moment of tension as the two prepared to grapple in this epic match between deceased and living, a literal wrestling death match. They eyed each other across the veil of mortality. Who would win? And then they leapt forward, gripped each other for approximately half a millisecond before Isaac was lifted from his feet by a supernatural power and thrown with tremendous force against a wall by the very much not insubstantial spirit. He slid down that wall, all the wind knocked out of him, temporarily unable to move, in immense pain. The boggart was the undisputed victor, no steel chair required here. Isaac lay there for a minute or maybe more, utterly defeated, but the ghost did not use the time to finish him. In fact, it seemed to disappear. Eventually, Isaac stood, painfully, shakily, and now, all bravado gone, he staggered out of the door, and after him called an echoing sepulchral voice, "The debt is not paid. Return at 2:00 tonight and make good on your wager." And Isaac fled into the night. He returned to his lodging, bruises slowly blossoming under his skin, and a damn sight more sober. His landlady heard him arrive back. Down she came, ready to give him a piece of her mind, but the expression on his face stopped her. It was a true terror that had drained his visage of all its colour, and he was trembling in a manner that left him unable to speak. Eventually, she got the story out of him, and other lodgers were roused, and all gathered around to hear the extraordinary tale. But as he talked in that candlelit parlour, his eyes kept flicking to the clock in the corner, its pendulum sickeningly swinging to and fro, the tick, tick, ticking, driving itself into his mind like a nail as the seconds advanced and 2 o'clock got ever closer. The lodgers tried to calm him down, convince him it had been some drunken hallucination, or perhaps he had encountered squatters or thieves and been confused. But Isaac was a man not unused to either drinking or drunken fights against physical opponents, and he knew that this was something very different indeed. They tried to dissuade him from going back, though tellingly for the scepticism they expressed, none actually offered to go with him. But Isaac wasn't having it. He was terrified to go back, yes, but terrified even more if he did not pay his strange boggart debt. Half a gallon of ale. I need half a gallon of ale. But there was no half a gallon of ale around. Money. I'll take money, said Isaac, and he gathered up coins to the equivalent of half a gallon of ale, on the generous side just to be sure. The residents of the house divided in their opinions of what exactly had happened, but united in telling him not to go back and not going with him, were roundly ignored. Empowered by fear and renewed adrenaline, Isaac headed back out towards the old spore houses, money in his pocket. His trembling increased as he approached. All attempts to calm himself had failed. His battered body was telling him to flee, but his mind urged him on, and demanded of him also that he not challenge ghosts to wagers or wrestling matches in future. Lessons that most people simply never need, but Isaac unfortunately could not count himself amongst their number. As the allotted time arrived, Isaac entered again that third house, clutching his lantern for dear life. And in front of him, there was the same man as before, but now even larger, fair filling that room, a shadowy giant looking down at him. Another match, Isaac. And he laughed horribly. From betwixt trembling lips came Isaac's reply. I'm good. Enough gambling for me, actually. Know your limits, be gambleaware.co.uk and all of that. Shame, said the boggart. There was a great blinding light, and in a flash of flame the boggart disappeared. Isaac threw the money he had brought down on the floor, turned tail and ran. And laughter echoed from the boggart house behind him, and in his mind it echoed for much, much longer. The shaken man took to his bed and didn't emerge for many days afterwards. And for longer after that, he touched not a drop of alcohol, made no bets, and gave the boggart houses of Spore Valley a wide berth. Now, you still might not be exactly clear on what a boggart is, and in that you would not be alone. You would, in fact, be in the eminent company of at least a lot of 19th century folklorists. But listen a little longer and you might start to get a bit more of an idea. And let's do that with one of those 19th century folklorists without whom this 50th episode would not be complete. This time actually featuring as a character in a story. Well, not really a story, more a little slice of life. On Grizzlehurst Lane, this one, nestled amongst the fields, the moors and wooded valleys between Rochdale and Bury. In the 1850s, 2 farmsteads remained of what had been the hamlet of Grizzlehurst, and Edwin Waugh is taking an afternoon stroll through the countryside along with a friend of his who lives in the general vicinity. Edwin himself hails from nearby Rochdale. He is a writer and a poet, who has risen from humble roots to achieve a limited amount of fame, and now he can spend some of his days simply a-rambling, collecting material for his newest work, as he studies the flora, the fauna, the buildings, and most fascinating of all, the country people. For these curiosities all warrant a place in his works. For however humble his roots, he is certainly a man not of country, but of town, and of the modern age. And while he certainly has a great deal of respect for rural dwellers, he also is wont to describe them thus, quote, "The old man's countenance had more country simplicity than patriarchal force of character in it, yet he was very comely to look upon, and seemed a natural part of the landscape around him." Unquote. The man who he was so describing was the owner of one of the remaining cottages at Grizzlehurst, and Edwin and friend had struck up conversation with him. Being British, they of course discussed the weather. "It's been nice." "Yep. I hear it's going to rain again." "To be sure of it." At this, out of the cottage's interior came the man's wife to greet the strangers, as a warm sunset began slowly to fall over the moors. And I quote again from Edwin here when I describe the wife. Quote, "Her light-complexioned face beamed with rustic health and simplicity." Unquote. In that gradually dwindling light, conversation turned to other safe topics. News from the town, the prospect for the crop this season, all until the visitors asked a question. "So, Grizzlehurst Old Hall, is it around here at all anywhere?" "The Old Hall," said the countryman in a thick accent which I shall, in my usual style, not attempt to replicate. "There ain't nothing to see now. The Old Hall's all gone." And he turned and pointed to a green meadow. "You wouldn't believe it to look at it, but when I was a lad, that was where the hall stood. A great place it was, and now nothing. The house went first, and then the orchards. Cut down all those trees, they did. Took the gardens away too, and put up that barn." He indicated. "All new-fangled stuff nowadays, and nowt like that hall around here no more. We took the great oak beams, you know. Me and Jimmy's son and some others carted them off. Fine as timber they were, and stones and what have you as well. All best quality stuff it was." "How long ago was all this?" asked Edwin. "Oh, I dunno." And he gazed off into the middle distance, plunged into deep nostalgia now. So his wife answered the question for him. 50 years ago this must have been," she said. And more happy memories of youth poured out of that old man, and he indicated this or that spot in the landscape which had been this or that feature of the house, and as his finger passed over one landmark, he lowered his voice. "And you see that bend in the lane where the ash tree grows?" "Yes." "Well, that. He paused for dramatic effect. "That is the spot where the Grizzlehurst Boggart is buried." The stark change in the topic of conversation took Edwin and companion aback. They looked intently at the spot and then back at the man's face, looking for some trace of jocularity, a sly twinkle in the eye that might suggest that this was all a wind-up. But if it was, he was playing his part very straight indeed. "The Grizzlehurst Boggart?" "Aye." And now the man trailed off, his previous verbosity deserting him. And there was a distinct chill in the summer air. His wife, now it was her time to shine. "A good while since it was laid, and a cockerel buried with it, and a stake put through the both of them. It was a right job to lay it too, and no mistake. They struggled with it, they did, but they got it in the ground." "You really think this place was haunted by a boggart?" She laughed at this. "Was. It is now. You'd soon know it if you lived here. It's always playing some marlock or other on you. You wouldn't find many folk who live round here who'll go down lane after daylight, I'll tell you that for free." Edwin considered this information. If one was to entertain that this was the grave of a boggart, that somebody, some priest or cunning person perhaps, for both were still known to be in the area at the time despite the advance of civilization, if they had gone to all that business with the cockerel and the stake and buried, Something under that ash tree, well, surely at the very least one would rather hope that the thing would not get up still. Would seem like a minimum requirement of doing the job of laying it, really. Fundamentally, if it was still walking around, then surely it wasn't in its grave. To Edwin that simply stood to that great God his kind had set all their store in, to reason. A way of thinking that was very modern and full of lazy misunderstanding. And so he voiced his confusion. But if it's laid and buried, then surely it don't trouble you much no more. Which made sense to him. Oh, well, that's all right then. No need to worry. If it doesn't cause trouble anymore, no problem at all, he says. It's all right, 'cause it's done and buried. She shook her head. Talking to folks who know nowt about such things, there's nowt to be done with them, is there? They'll only learn by force, I reckon. But them who knows, they knows. The old man spoke up to back up his wife. You say it don't trouble us now it's buried, but weren't more than a fortnight ago when the farmer's wife at the end there, he indicated one of the few remaining complete cottagers, she heard something in the dead of night, and then she was thrown right out of her bed. Aye, his wife nodded along. I knew it were the Boggarts straight away, and ever since it happened she's been as timid as a church mouse. Whenever the day strays to the edge of darkness and she finds herself here alone, well, she trailed off. It was the edge of dark now. Yes, said the man, the pair of them getting quite animated now. No use telling folks me they don't believe it. The things we see round here, what it's done. It's a flaysome thing indeed, cut in his wife. A great word, that, flaysome, meaning terrifying, frightful, because we haven't quite had enough dialect synonyms for those words already this episode. Upsetting the animals and turning carts over and shifting stuff all around the house when the folks are abed. But I know there's not much point telling folks who don't believe about it. The pair paused long enough for War's unnamed companion to say, And it's buried over there. Aye, that it is, in the hollow, by that old ash tree. Have you ever thought about digging it up? Dig it up? Never, said the man. And the wife came in again. Ain't no one dare lay a finger on that ground. There's fellas round here that have gone to war and come back, and they won't touch the grizzler's boggart. On this theme for a little more they talked, but the wife eventually said, I don't reckon you two gentlemen believe a word we've said about it. But not unpleasantly just telling it how it was. And their reaction proved this to be true, and that caused them all to laugh a little, as she got the right of them there. And their conversation moved on. Eventually the two men bid their temporary companions farewell, and continued on as the sun set, the fields bathed in the long evening light, the sky a vivid red. Through the nearby clough they journeyed for an hour or so down to Rochdale Road. By the time they reached it, the twinkling stars and the sickle silver blade of a new moon could be seen in the twilight. And along the road they returned to their lodgings. As they sat in a warm, candle-lit room discussing the day's adventure, Edwin found himself thinking of those remote cottagers. How at this time of night they would fall silent, save for the sounds of the crickets, the echoing ticking of the clock, the rustling of trees, the low sighing of the winds around the walls. And how the ears of a superstitious listener might turn these into the voice of the supernatural. And how that couple in their homestead would surely be trying to ignore the haunted gloom more carefully than usual after their conversation with the two sceptical gentlemen about the grave of the Grizzlehurst Boggart. So that's one more boggart, a piece of data which you can add to your other examples that might be now making what a boggart is clearer. And honestly, I could go on with tens more accounts, and I kind of want to, but if you want sources, many are available and linked on my website, and I fear your attention may be waning by this point. Or perhaps your attention has turned to considering what awaits for yourself in the darkness in the Edge lands. So, as to try and not overstay my welcome, I'm going to leave you with just one more story. This time it was a dark and stormy night. The day before a wedding. Nearby to Horton it was, a small village on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, which would see it radically transformed by the growth in mills and eventually subsumed into Bradford. But at this point in time it was a more rural affair. Hilltop farmsteads and scattered cottages were the order of the day. The march of modernity had not yet trodden the landscape underfoot. In one of those farmsteads, if you think back to the prologue, you may remember, lived a woman by the name of Rebecca, but everyone called her Fair Becca, for she was the most beautiful woman in Horton, and tomorrow was her wedding day. An event that, if you do remember that prologue, you already know she will not make. But for the moment, let's set aside that knowledge, along with any concerns we might have about the problematic nature of a community agreeing on a nickname for a young woman that is based on her physicality and adherence to traditional beauty standards, and what that might mean for her or her peers. I think that's one of those asides that gets me the slightly more negative reviews, but fuck it. Let's ignore it for now anyway, and instead join Fair Becca as she sits in the farmhouse. Nervous, excited, somewhat giddy in fact. Preparations for the wedding, such as they were in this not well-to-do family, finished, done. She'd worked most of that day in the farm as any other, and all that day, though it didn't show yet, she had carried with her a babe that now grew inside her. But for her child she didn't need to worry, for though she had done things out of the proper order, she wasn't alone amongst her peers. 1,000 folk songs testify to it. And unlike many of the men in those ballads, she had a love good and true in her sweet William. He had done the decent, the honourable thing and proposed, and now a bright future, a family life awaited her. She pondered that she would soon be moving onto the stage of her life as wife and mother, probably the best she could realistically expect in this society. There were far worse fates. As she was lost in thought, there came a gentle tap on her ground-floor bedroom window. She looked up, but not in alarm, with a smile on her face, for she recognised that tap, that same tap that her William had used many a night when he had come courting her. And just as she had done so many times before, she slipped out a side door unnoticed. He beamed when he saw her, and though the night was cold and thick with rain, Becca felt warm joy inside of her. "What are you doing here? We'll be married tomorrow." Becca, I just thought perhaps one last ride, like we've done before. It's not going to be the same after today." Becca looked over her childhood friend turned lover turned fiancé with an affection that threatened her heart to burst. "But look at all this rain," she half-heartedly protested. "All romantic film heroine vibes." "It's the last time we can sneak off together," he said. "Tomorrow will be man and wife, and everything will have to be much more serious." And William, the farmer's son, affected a stiff posture and turned his nose up severely in imitation of some snotty gentleman or priest. "Okay, one last time." And the two crouched slightly, snuck off in the usual direction, were not seen. And to the lane they went where he'd hitched his horse, and he swung up front, helped her on behind, and away the couple raced into the night. The storm intensified as they rode through the country lanes of West Yorkshire, and as the thunder crashed and the lightning crackled down, Becca screamed in wild abandon and joy. This, all of this, young love and child and marriage and reckless riding at high speed, all of it was what life was about, what adulthood was about. It was all hers, and she felt so alive. And neither him nor her gave thought to the Boggarts that might lurk in the country after dark. For at that time, while I'm sure there were some, there was no famous Horton Boggart, as there would be in years to come. As she whooped and hollered in joy, if Becca could see the expression of her beloved on the front of the horse, in the darkness within his hood, she would have been confused. For rather than the uninhibited joy of young love, he wore an expression of steely, grim determination. The horse was travelling at full pelt now, the rain coming down faster and harder, and Becca eventually cried out, "OK, let's go back." "Not long now," said William, darkly, as their mount turned a corner and the pair found themselves high on the edge of a great disused mining pit. "Here we are." And despite the noise of the storm, Becca could tell that his voice wasn't right. "William!" And he turned to her then, and the look on his face was a vile one, and as the horse slowed, he screamed, "Prepare yourself to die!" Becca's whole body was riven with a terror the like of which she'd never known as William reached round with the strong arms in which she'd found such solace now horrendously turned to instruments of tremendous violence. The feeorin, the Boggarts, the flaysome folk might be terrifying indeed, but they paled into insignificance next to the most terrifying thing in the world, a man bent on murder. Becca did not know that he'd found another local girl, had decided that he rather liked the roving life, that he didn't want to settle down with her, and that there was no socially acceptable way out of this wedding for him, so he'd taken the next obvious step and turned instead to planning the horrible, cold-blooded murder of the woman he professed to love. Becca screamed and screamed as she clung on for dear life as the horse ran round and round the edge of the great dark pit, and he screamed back at her as he tried to lift her from the horse. But she clung on for dear life as around the pit he went, once, twice, her shrieking all the while, and on the third time he finally wrested her from her saddle, and down went Becca into the deep, dark pit, striking the sides as she fell, with sickening crunches that knocked the scream out of her, and she hit the bottom with a very final splash that was almost drowned out by the rain. William halted the horse, and for a brief moment, panting heavily, he looked down into that void, a place he'd chosen specially for its remoteness and depth. He waited, looked for movement as though she might come racing out to avenge herself, but there was nothing. And then he pulled on the horse's reins, gave the beast a squeeze with his legs, and there was the tremendous sound of hoofbeats as the murderer rode off into a night that was rich in pathetic fallacy. If you remember the introduction, you'll know that the next day there was no wedding. William had composed himself to act as distressed as any prospective husband might be. Someone had heard her scream, so foul play was top suspicion, and there weren't that many suspects. Nevertheless, no body was recovered. Missing persons investigations at that time were very unsophisticated, and the lonely woman traversing the road might meet her end at the hands of all sorts of unsavoury villains, and yes, Boggarts too. And so, with no leads, after a week or two, things began to die down. The community was bereft, and even those who held hope that fair Becca was somewhere safe had to contend with the idea that the only way that that was possible was if she had betrayed them all and her own true love. And for a little while William was certain he had gotten clean away with his heinous crime. For the most part, suspicion did not fall on him. But eventually it came from perhaps an unexpected source, those who knew him best. His own family, closest to him, they noticed how strange he had become. And not in the way of a man bereaved, no. They remembered how he had come home late the night before the wedding, the wild look in his eyes. And they noticed how in the week since he had seemed to show flickers of relief he quickly quelled when he heard that his bride-to-be had not been found. How he had already been seen with another girl from the neighbourhood, and while nothing was voiced, the weight of dark suspicion began to hang over the heads of all his family until it oppressed every conversation he had with them. It all came to a head one day during a terrible silent evening's tea, when, unable to bear it any longer, he stood up and addressed to all assembled, "I have done nothing wrong. I am your son and your brother, and a man bereaved of my love, and you think so ill of me? Well, if anyone has come to harm through me, then let me never rise from my bed again, and let my horse die in its stable from the rot." And off he stormed, full of unrighteous indignation. And listener, you'll never guess what happened. He was struck down in the night by some terrible illness, and while he lingered for a while, never again did he leave his bed alive. And his poor horse, an accessory to murder, though hardly a willing one, died of the rot in the stable. His role in the disappearance of Becca was now so starkly called out by the very powers that be, that William made a confession on his deathbed in the hope that this might absolve him of his sins. And following this, the mangled corpse of poor Becca was recovered from the pit. William died, and the story of poor fair Becca, murdered on her wedding night by her husband-to-be, passed into local legend and was oft repeated. And so ends the tale of the murder of fair Becca. And you might very reasonably be thinking to yourself, hang on, where's the boggart? But you see, this wasn't the end of fair Becca. 10 years later, and two young lovers meet in the shade of a great tree at the edge of the woods in Horton. That, a decade ago, a young woman's broken body had been found at the bottom of a pit a few hundred metres away might have been something that they were aware of, remembered from childhood, but it was not consciously in their thoughts tonight. Tonight they were simply focused very much on each other, and on the wild passions that coursed through their bodies, as they finally found space away from prying eyes to be together. But they were not yet quite sure of their love enough to begin hungrily devouring each other, even though each of them wished it dearly. A full moon was high in the sky, and beneath it, between them, the night-time air fair crackled with the tension of the two lovers. Though her body and heart were more than eager, the young woman needed reassurance, needed to know that he would be true to her, needed to know that he truly loved her, much more important then than it might be now, for indeed her whole future potentially rested on it. So she asked him to tell her, and he did. He said all the right things, all the words about how his heart belonged only to her, how he would love her to his dying day. As he looked deeply into the face of this fair village maiden and spoke with such conviction of the highest ideals of commitment, he did not notice, in the forest behind her, the figure in white that drifted amongst the trees. The figure that stared intently at him as those honeyed words spilled out, which looked not just at him, but right into him, into his heart and soul, hoping that he spoke only a pure, unalloyed truth. Many had spoken truthfully, and when the men did speak so, that strange floating figure, well, she would fade into the night, filled with joy that true, pure love still had a place in this world, and for a little while her wandering soul would be warmed by the beauty of that truth. But not tonight. No, tonight, when she stared into the soul of this man, she saw him as though covered in horrible pustules of deceit, weeping oily lies. But his darling, she was blind to them. And for her part, she reached up to him, flung her arms around his neck, and reached in for that first nervous, passionate kiss. And as she did so, the Boggart of Horton, the Boggart of Fair Becca, issued forth a terrible shriek that rended the night in two. The same wailing as when she'd been on that horse around that terrible pit all those years before, but with a supernatural power now behind them. The young couple leapt apart, looked around, and beheld Becca there in all her flaysome glory. And they ran as fast as they could out of the woods, away from the figure in its white dress that glided through the night, pursuing the false young man. When morning came, the two had survived, but had been separated, fled back to their respective homes, and poured out the tale of what they had seen in a terrified flood of words. And both had been told by their families what this meant. That the Horton Boggart, the shade of Fair Becca, would reserve her shrieks for those lovers whose words were false. And after that experience, well, the young woman wisely learned her lesson and did not tryst again with that man. And less likely, but possible, he learned his lesson, and made his next vow of undying allegiance a true one. Though by far her most notable characteristic, Fair Becca did not just save young women from the perils of false relationships, like some sort of ghastly avenging superhero. No, sometimes, perhaps when there were no courting couples, she would simply wander the woods, the roads, the cloughs, the places she had known in life and the place she had been betrayed, and in the midnight hour her wild shriek could be heard echoing across the hills and valleys, startling nighttime travellers, and waking with terror those asleep in the farmhouses. It was a cry filled with terror and pain and loss for her love and loss for her life, all that she might have been, now lonely in death. Tales of her were told around the firelight, and lovers warned to be true, and sometimes true lovers did set eyes on her. An eyewitness account puts it better than I can. An old man, recalling the time he walked out one autumn evening with a woman to whom he was truly devoted. It was about that time that the soft twilight, mingling with the first rays of the moon, cast all around a sort of dreamy shadowing. Hand in hand we walked, silently, as if fearing to break with voice or word the spell that held us, and on we walked, until we came to our loved trysting place, where oft we'd sat beneath an aged oak, happy in ourselves, the whole world to each other. That night scarcely a breath of air caused a rustle in the trees, and all around us looked as lovely as an angel's dwelling place. When suddenly a mighty wind came rushing through the trees, scattering the crisp orange leaves around us. And when we looked around, we saw a beauteous form, like to a youthful maiden coming towards us. She seemed to glide along the air, for neither sound of falling footstep or rustling of a garment did we hear. But I remember well, her face was pale as was the moonbeam in whose light she walked. She passed, and when we turned to look, the form had faded from view. For many years, the Boggart of Horton terrified the people of the area, while at the same time protecting quite a few young women, and stories continued to be whispered about her. But eventually, she ceased to be seen or heard. But in her disappearance, she was much like most of the Boggarts that I've told you about. For once, the after-dark landscape was full of Boggarts of every sort, a treacherous place of terror for travellers. Many a lane, a house, a copse or a field would play host to them, and numerous were the folk who had seen them with their own eyes, and even more numerous those who had heard them and seen the after-effects of their little tricks, even those that had supposedly been laid. But as the years of the 19th century marched forwards, great changes swept the lands. The steam engines came, and great swathes were cut through the land, iron tracks laid upon them, followed by the noise of whistle and wheels and the bright light shining out in the nights. The mills and the factories and the houses that grew up around them expanded the cities and towns as never before, and hungrily tore and ate up the countryside. People flocked or were pushed to these new places. Greenery vanished under smoke that filled the air from towering chimneys, and eventually electric lights and the motor car. A century later, and the land was unrecognisable, buried under the modern world, a modern world that brought with it more and more men, and eventually even a few women, educated in the ways of Edwin Waugh, with a delight in dismissing superstition, to ignore all signs of the supernatural, to impose a rationality on all occurrences in the world, and to treat with scarce despised contempt and scorn any who did not believe as they did. The effects of all of this seemed to combine to reduce the Boggarts, not to eradicate them completely at first, far from it. Encounters with Boggarts and tales of them continued for many a year, and the landscape even now remains littered with Boggart houses, Boggart farms, Boggart holes, that stand as monuments to the once mighty age of the bygone Boggarts. But over time, the numbers of the feeorin and the Boggarts declined ever further. In all their beautiful myriad forms, those solitary nighttime terrors, the ghostly horses, the flame-eyed dogs, the men without heads, the woman who I couldn't get into this, who carries her head in a basket and throws it like a bowling ball, the creature with large eyes and horns that haunted the churchyard, the invisible force that threw people from their beds, the spectre that left bloody stains on the wooden floors, even the beautiful maidens in their moonlit dresses and their blood-curdling screams. In the 2010s, a survey was done about Boggarts in the areas that they haunted, asking for memories of them. Quite a few people said, as one respondent did, "Never heard of Boggarts until I saw this survey." But not everybody, for at least some remembered still. Quote, "Grew up in the 1950s and early 1960s. We were always told to be in before it goes dark, or else the Boggarts will get you." Unquote. And perhaps there's even one or two left out there still. So that brings us to the end of this little collection of Boggart ephemera. I realise I didn't actually have a proper story in there, but I hope you can forgive me for that. I also remember now that I threw in a framing narrative at some point that I never returned to and haven't resolved, and I hate it when that happens, looking at you, Disney's Aladdin. So I feel particularly bad for that. You'll have to create your own ending to that if you somehow remember it. Maybe the narrator telling the stories got eaten by Boggarts. Maybe the children they were telling the stories to were Boggarts. Maybe they were a Boggart. Maybe everyone went to bed and no one was a Boggart at all. Maybe the whole house was a Boggart house, everybody was a Boggart, and they just disappeared into the night. Ooh. Anyway, that aside, that is it. 50th episode over. I am genuinely so delighted to have been able to bring this to you. Thank you again to everyone who is listening. If this is your first time, if this is your 50th, I really do owe it all to you guys. Thank you. I can't wait to do more episodes after this one, and more live shows, and more other things in the wider Tales of Britain and Ireland world. No, that's not quite right. You know what I mean. So the next episode, there will be a discussion section, the first ever expert discussion section. If you like it, we might have more. I hope that you do, but I realise it's veering a little bit off what I've done so far. And in that discussion section, you might actually get to find out what this thing I've been talking to you about all episode actually is. Bring your own ideas, see how you get on. And at the end of that episode, there will be a little story as well. I'm not sure whether I'm going to call that the 51st episode or 50th episode part 2. I'll work that out though, and that will genuinely be out soon in the next couple of weeks. For the episode after that, no idea, but I'm definitely this time just picking something nice and easy and running with it, given how long this has taken. I've had complaints. So next time, maybe it'll be a fairy tale or something like that, which I can just get my teeth into, and you can listen along to, of course. Of course, the plug has to happen at this point though, so if you do want more of Tales of Britain and Ireland content, I do have a Patreon. There are 12 Patreon members episodes now. You only ever pay when I release one. Thank you to all my patrons for supporting me on there, and thank you specifically this time to Melissa Lawrence, Mazel Basil or Mazel Basil, and Melissa Mullins, a Melissa heavy month here, who have signed up since the last time. That is really it. Join me again much sooner than usual for that expert discussion section and find out what the hell these Boggarts are that you've just listened to a whole episode about. You can follow Tales of Britain and Ireland podcast on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. There's also a website, talesofbritainandireland.com, where there's a page for each episode which contains more information including illustrations, asides and recaps, along with other additional bits and pieces to explore. The intro music was written and performed by Alice Nichols, and the outro music by Mitch Keeley and Josh Newman, and you can find all the other musical credits on the episode page on the website. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it with others or give it a review, as those really are the best ways to help us out. You can also join Tales of Britain and Ireland on Patreon to get extra members episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again soon.